Good day and welcome to One-on-One Maths Private Tutors. Today we look at O-Level and IGCSE Biology. The topic is movement into and out of cells. We look at osmosis, diffusion, and active transport. Diffusion. Molecules in gases move about in a random way. They have kinetic energy and bump into one another and spread out to fill up all the space available. Molecules of ions dissolved in a liquid do this as well, although it takes longer for them to fill the space. Movement in a gas is faster as the molecules are more spread out. The difference in speed between movement in gases and liquids is important for organisms. This movement of molecules is called diffusion. When molecules or ions diffuse, they spread out from where there are lots of them, that is the area of high concentration, to where there are not as many of them, that is to an area of low concentration. The difference between the concentration of molecules in two places is called a concentration gradient. Molecules carry on diffusing until they are spread out evenly. When this happens, the molecules keep moving, but there is no longer a difference in concentrations, so diffusion has stopped. So if we have a substance that is soluble in water, placed in water, at this position, this substance is in high concentration, and at other positions here it is in low concentration. So this substance will spread out from this region of high concentration to regions where it is in low concentration, so that after diffusion, the particles are spread out evenly throughout the liquid. For diffusion in gases, the molecules of a colored gas will spread throughout the gas until they are evenly distributed, filling up all the space available. For definition, diffusion is the movement of molecules or ions from a region of high concentration to a region of lower concentration down a concentration gradient. Cells gain some of the substances they need by diffusion from their surroundings. They also lose some of their waste substances to their surroundings by diffusion. These substances have to cross cell membranes that are partially permeable, as they allow the movement of small molecules such as oxygen, carbon dioxide, and water to pass through easily, but not larger molecules. The movement of molecules by diffusion across the cell membrane is passive movement, as the cells do not need to use energy to move the molecules. So diffusion is what we call a passive process, which occurs naturally. Now we look at the factors affecting diffusion. The first one is surface area. So if we have two blocks of a soluble substance and we crush one into a powder and we place them in water of equal volume, the one which has been crushed to powder will diffuse quicker than the solid block. This is because by crushing, the powder has more surface area for water molecules to work on, and therefore it will diffuse quicker. The solid block has less surface area for water molecules to work on and spread the soluble solid, therefore taking more time to diffuse. So we can conclude that the more the surface area, the higher the rate of diffusion. And the less the surface area, the lower the rate of diffusion. So we'll see the powder will dissolve and diffuse faster than the solid. The next factor that affects the rate of diffusion is temperature. An increase in temperature gives molecules and ions more kinetic energy. This allows them to move faster, so the process of diffusion speeds up. So in this experiment, we have cold water, tap water, and hot water. Cold water may be at 3 degrees, the tap water is at around 15 degrees, and hot water is around 100 degrees. Then we pour equal amounts of food coloring. You can see in the hot water, it has already dissolved and spread about. Cold water is the slowest. In the hot water, diffusion is complete. The tap water will be faster than the cold water. You can see more diffusion is happening here in the tap water. The higher the temperature, the faster the rate of diffusion. So in conclusion, we can say the higher the temperature, the faster the rate of diffusion. And the lower the temperature, the slower the rate of diffusion. Now we move on to concentration gradient as another factor that affects the rate of diffusion. The greater the difference in the concentration of a substance on either side of a membrane, the faster it will diffuse. The difference is called a concentration gradient. So we can conclude by saying the greater the concentration gradient, the faster the rate of diffusion. The lesser the concentration gradient, the slower the rate of diffusion. Now we move on to distance as a factor that affects the rate of diffusion. Cell membranes are all about the same thickness, approximately 0.007 micrometers. But plant cell walls vary in their thickness and permeability. Usually, the thicker the cell wall, the slower the rate of diffusion. From this illustration, we can see that this cell has a thin cell wall, and this cell wall is thick. So it will take a long time for particles to diffuse through this cell wall than to diffuse through that thinner cell wall. So distance here is greater than the distance here for particles to diffuse. When oxygen diffuses from the alveoli of the lungs into red blood cells, it travels through the cell membranes of the alveoli and the blood capillaries and the red blood cells, as well as the cytoplasm of each cell. This increased distance slows down the rate of diffusion. Now let's look at the structure of the alveolus in the lungs and see how distance affects the rate of diffusion. The alveolus is a structure in our lungs where gaseous exchange takes place, where oxygen that we breathe in from the air is passed into the bloodstream to the red blood cells, and carbon dioxide that we breathe out is taken out of the bloodstream into our lungs. Now, let's look at the distance that oxygen has to move from our lungs into the bloodstream. The alveolus is a cell thick, and each of these structures represent a cell. The capillaries are also a cell thick. So oxygen has to pass through this membrane here, this cytoplasm, this membrane there, this membrane there, this cytoplasm, this membrane here. So we're talking about a total of 1, 2, 3, 4 membranes before it gets in contact with the blood, and it also has to pass through the membrane of the red blood cell for it to finally pass into the red blood cell. So we're talking of a total of 5 membranes and 2 cytoplasms before it finally gets into the red blood cell, where it can be carried to body cells. So in conclusion, we can say the greater the distance, the slower the rate of diffusion, and the shorter the distance, the faster the rate of diffusion. So to summarize it, we can say diffusion is proportional to surface area. Diffusion is proportional to temperature. Diffusion is proportional to concentration, gradient. And diffusion is inversely proportional to distance. This means that as surface area increases, diffusion also increases. As temperature increases, diffusion also increases. As concentration gradient increases, diffusion increases. But when distance increases, diffusion decreases. Now we move on to osmosis. Osmosis is the movement of water molecules from a region of higher water potential or higher water concentration to a region of lower water potential or lower water concentration through a partially permeable membrane. So osmosis is the movement of water from a region of its high concentration to a region of its low concentration across a partially permeable membrane. So this definition tells us that osmosis is the diffusion of water across a partially permeable membrane. Because water is a very important resource in living organisms, a special definition of its diffusion called osmosis had to be developed. What are the roles of water in living organisms? Most cells contain about 75% water and will die if their water content falls much below this. Water is a good solvent, and many substances move about the cell in a watery solution. Water molecules take part in many vital chemical reactions. For example, in green plants, water combines with carbon dioxide to form sugar in a process called photosynthesis. In animals, water also helps to break down and dissolve food molecules in a process called digestion. Blood is made up of cells and a liquid called plasma. This plasma is 92% water and is a way of transporting many dissolved substances like carbon dioxide, urea, digested food, and hormones. Blood cells are carried around the body in plasma. Water is also a way of transporting materials in plants. Water passes up the plant from the roots to the leaves in xylem vessels and carries dissolved mineral ions. Phloem vessels transport dissolved sugar and amino acids from the leaves to where they are used or stored. Water is important in the process of excretion in animals. It is a powerful solvent for excretory materials like nitrogenous molecules such as urea, as well as mineral ions used in hormones and drugs. Water has a diluting effect, so excretory materials are less toxic or less poisonous as they move. Now let's look at how diffusion of water or osmosis takes place. If a dilute solution is separated from a concentrated solution by a partially permeable membrane, water will diffuse across the membrane from the dilute to the concentrated solution. This is called osmosis. So we can see in this table, this is a dilute solution and this is a concentrated solution. So water will move from the dilute solution into the concentrated solution across this partially permeable membrane. So as a result, the level on this side will go down because water is being lost, and the level on this side will go up because there is gain of water. To illustrate this, we can use this diagram. This is a partially permeable membrane which only allows small molecules like water. The circles in blue represent water molecules which can pass through the semi-permeable membrane, and the red circles represent sugar molecules, which are larger molecules that cannot pass through the membrane. And we can see that here there is a high water concentration, here there is a low water concentration. So water molecules will move through this partially permeable membrane into this solution of sugar and water. And we'll see the level here rising and the level here going down. A partially permeable membrane is permeable but allows water to pass through more rapidly than dissolved substances. Since a dilute solution effectively contains more water molecules than a concentrated solution, there is a high concentration gradient, which encourages the passage of water from the dilute solution to the concentrated solution. In living cells, cell membrane is partially permeable, and the cytoplasm and vacuole in plant cells contain dissolved substances. As a result, water tends to diffuse into cells by osmosis if they are surrounded by a weak solution, such as fresh or pure water. If the cells are surrounded by a stronger solution, such as seawater, the cells may lose water by osmosis. Now let's look at how osmosis affects animal cells. The cell in this diagram is shown surrounded by pure water. Nothing is dissolved in the water. It is 100% concentration of water molecules. So the concentration of free water molecules outside the cell is greater than the concentration of water molecules inside. As a result, water will diffuse into the cell. So water will move into the cell by osmosis. The liquid outside the cell does not have to be 100% pure water. If the concentration of the water outside is higher than that inside, water will diffuse in by osmosis. So B here shows the cell swelling up because it is gaining water. Too much uptake or loss of water by osmosis may damage cells. For this reason, it is very important that the cells in an animal's body are surrounded by a liquid which has the same concentration as the liquid inside the cell. So if the cell continues to take up water, it may burst. Now let's move to plant cells. The cytoplasm of a plant cell and the cell sap in its vacuole contain mineral ions, sugars, and proteins in solution. This reduces the concentration of free water molecules inside the cell. The cell wall is freely or fully permeable to water and dissolved substances. This means the cell wall is not partially permeable, but the cell membrane is partially permeable. If a plant cell is surrounded by water or a dilute solution than its contents, water will pass into the vacuole by osmosis. So if we have a plant cell, this part is the cell wall, which allows water and dissolved substance to pass through it. And we have a cell membrane here, which is selectively or partially permeable. And we have our vacuole there, our cytoplasm being concentrated, and a solution outside the cell that is dilute. Water will move into the cell by osmosis. The vacuole will expand and press outwards on the cytoplasm because it is now filling up with water. The cell wall of a plant cell does not stretch, so the inflow of water is limited by the inelastic cell wall. The cell wall will maintain the structure of the cell, unlike animal cells that burst when they are filled with water. The plant cells will not burst because they have this structural cell wall that will maintain the cell. When water inside the vacuole pushes against the cytoplasm and the cell wall, we say the plant is experiencing turgor pressure. So this push against the cytoplasm and the cell wall is what we call turgor pressure. And when the cell is filled with water like this, we say the cell is turgid. When plant cells have absorbed a maximum amount of water by osmosis, they become very rigid due to the pressure of water pressing outwards on the cell wall. So this pressure is what we call turgor pressure. As a result, the stems and leaves are supported. If the cell loses water, there is no longer any pressure pressing outwards against the cell wall. So the stems and leaves are not supported anymore. So how does this happen? If we have a concentrated solution outside the cell and a dilute solution inside the cell, what happens is water moves out of the vacuole, the cytoplasm, and out of the cell by osmosis. The vacuole shrinks. The cell membrane pulls back from the cell wall, and we say the cell is flaccid. This is the cell membrane. This is the cell wall. So we see the cell membrane pulling back from the cell wall. The vacuole loses water and it shrinks. And this is our cytoplasm. So we can see the difference between a turgid cell and a flaccid cell. The loss of water from a cell is what we call plasmolysis. And we can say this cell is plasmolized or flaccid. So plasmolysis is the process by which a plant cell loses water and shrink. And flaccid refers to a state where a plant cell loses its firmness or becomes limp. So this is a flaccid cell. This is a turgid cell. If plant cells continuously lose water, there will come a point where the plant becomes limp and it wilts, which means its leaves and stems will droop. So this is an example of a wilting plant. It's droopy, and this is an example of a plant whose cells are turgid. It is firm. The importance of water potential and osmosis in plants. A plant cell with a vacuole pushing out on the cell wall is turgid. It is swollen because the cell has taken up water, and the vacuole is exerting turgor pressure on the inelastic cell wall. Turgor pressure is the force inside the cell which pushes outwards, pushing the cell membrane against the cell wall. If all the cells in the leaf and stem are turgid, the stem will be firm and upright. The leaves are held out straight. If the vacuole loses water, the cell will lose their turgor. This process is called plasmolysis, and the cell becomes flaccid. Plasmolysis is the process of losing water from the cell. When a cell loses water and is between the state of being turgid and plasmolized, it is flaccid. If a plant has flaccid cells, the leaves will be limp and the stem will droop. A plant that loses too much water is wilting. Root hair cells are touching water trapped between soil particles. When the water potential of the cell sap is lower than the water potential of the soil water, the water will enter the cell by osmosis. This gives the plant the water it needs. This process is called water uptake. Now we move to active transport. Active transport is the movement of molecules or ions into or out of a cell through a cell membrane from a region of their lower concentration to a region of their higher concentration against a concentration gradient using energy released during respiration. So we have seen that diffusion and osmosis are what we call passive processes, which means they do not require energy. But active transport, as the name suggests, is active, not passive. which means it requires energy from the cells. Now, in diffusion, if we have a weak solution and a strong solution, in diffusion, particles of the solution will move from the strong solution to the weak solution. And in osmosis, water will move from a weak solution to a strong solution. But in active transport, particles will move from a weak solution to a strong solution using energy stored in the cell. So this is against the concentration gradient. Concentration gradient is in this direction from a strong solution to a weak solution. What is the importance of active transport? If diffusion was the only way a cell could take in substances, a cell could have no control over what went in or out. Anything that was more concentrated outside would diffuse into the cell, even if it was harmful. Substances which the cells need would diffuse out as soon as their concentration inside the cell increase above their concentration outside. However, the cell membrane has a lot of control over the substance which enter and leave the cell. In some cases, substances are not taken into or removed from the cell against the concentration gradient. For example, plants need to absorb mineral ions from the soil, but these ions are in very dilute solution. Active transport allows the root hair cells of plants to take up mineral ions from this dilute solution against the concentration gradient. Again, energy from respiration is converted into kinetic energy for movement of the ions. Sodium ions may continue to pass out of a cell even though the concentration outside is greater than inside. In digestion, the cells lining the small intestines take up glucose against a concentration gradient. The process by which substances are moved against a concentration gradient is described as active transport. So for an example, let's say we have a human cell there with a cytoplasm and cell membrane. The surrounding liquid has a low concentration of glucose, and inside here there is a high concentration of glucose. Now, the passive process that is supposed to happen here is the loss of glucose from the cell to the surrounding fluid. But for some reason, the cell might want to absorb the little glucose that is here and does not want to lose the glucose that is inside here. The cell membrane is a structure that doesn't only physically allow substances to pass through it, it has much greater control. So it uses the energy generated inside the cell to pull in the glucose it wants inside the cell against the concentration gradient. Because by diffusion, glucose is supposed to move out from a region of its higher concentration to a region of its lower concentration. But active transport acts in the opposite direction to make sure that the cell gets what it wants and does not lose what it wants inside the cell. So that is the difference between active transport and diffusion. Thank you.